welcome back to part 2 of chapter 11. Alex pulled the padlock out and grabbed hold of the trapdoor. It took all his strength to pull it up, and as he did so, a blast of cold air hit him in the face. The trapdoor clanged back, and he found himself looking into a black hole that stretched further than the daylight could reach. Alex shone his torch into the hole. The beam went about 50 metres, but the shaft went further. He found a pebble and dropped it in. At least 10 seconds passed before the pebble rattled against something far below. A rusty ladder ran down the side of the shaft. Alex checked that the quad was out of sight, then looped the rope over his shoulder and shoved the torch into his belt. He didn't enjoy climbing into the hole. The metal rungs were ice cold against his hands, and his shoulders had barely sunk beneath the level of the ground before the light was blotted out, and he felt himself being sucked into a darkness so total that he couldn't even be sure he had eyes. But he couldn't climb and hold on to the torch. He just had to feel his way, a hand, then a foot, descending further and ever further, until at last his heel struck the ground and he knew he had reached the bottom of Kernweck's shaft. He looked up. He could just make out the entrance he had climbed through, a small, round, as distant as the moon. Breathing heavily, trying to fight off the sense of claustrophobia, he pulled out the torch and flicked it on. The beam leapt out of his hand, pointing the way ahead and throwing pure white light onto his immediate surroundings. Alex was at the start of a long tunnel, the uneven walls and ceiling held back by wooden beams. The floor was already damp and a sheen of salt water hung in the air. It was cold in the mine. He had known it would be, and before he moved he pulled on the jersey he had bought, then chalked a large X on the wall. That had been a good idea too. Whatever happened down here, he wanted to be sure he could find a way back. At last he was ready. He took 2 steps forward, away from the vertical shaft and into the start of the tunnel, and immediately felt the weight of the solid rock, soil, and remaining streaks of tin bearing down on him. It was horrible here. It really was like being buried alive, and it took all his strength to force himself on. After about 50 paces, he came to a second tunnel, branching off to the left. He took out the photocopied map and examined it in the torchlight. According to Ian Ryder, this was where he had to turn off. He swung the torch around and followed the tunnel, which slanted downwards, taking him deeper and deeper into the earth. There was absolutely no sound in the mine, apart from his own rasping breath, the crunch of his footsteps, and the quickening thud of his heart. It was as if the blackness was wiping out sound as well as vision. Alex opened his mouth and called out, just to hear something, but his voice sounded small and only reminded him of the huge weight above his head. This tunnel was in bad repair. Some of the beams had snapped and fallen in as he passed. A trickle of gravel hit his neck and shoulders, reminding him that Doesbury Mine had been kept locked for a reason. It was a hellish place. It could collapse at any time. The path took him ever deeper. He could feel the pressure pounding in his ears, and the darkness seemed even thicker and more oppressive. He came to a tangle of iron and wire, some sort of machine long ago buried and forgotten. He climbed over it too quickly, cutting his leg on a piece of jagged metal. He stood still for a few seconds, forcing himself to slow down. He knew he couldn't panic. If you panic, you'll get lost. Think what you're doing. Be careful. One step at a time. Okay. He whispered the words to reassure himself, then continued forward. Now he emerged into a sort of wide circular chamber, formed by the meeting of 6 different tunnels, all coming together in a star shape. The widest of these slanted in from the left with the remains of a railway track. He swung the torch and picked out a couple of wooden wagons, which must have been used to carry equipment down or tin back up to the surface. Checking the maps, he was tempted to follow the railway, which seemed to offer a shortcut across the route that Ian Ryder had drawn. But he decided against it. His uncle had turned the corner and gone back on himself. There had to be a reason. Alex made another 2 chalk crosses, one for the tunnel he had left another for the one he was entering. He went on. This new tunnel quickly became lower and narrower until Alex couldn't walk unless he crouched. The floor was very wet too, with pools of water reaching his ankles. He remembered how near he was to the sea, and that brought another unpleasant thought. What time was high tide? And when the water rose, what would happen inside the mine? Alex suddenly had a vision of himself trapped in blackness, with the water rising up his chest, his neck over his face. He stopped and forced himself to think of something else. Down here, on his own, far beneath the surface of the earth, he couldn't make an enemy of his imagination. The tunnel curved, then joined a second railway line, this one bent and broken, covered here and there in rubble, which must have fallen from above. But the metal tracks made it easier to move forward, picking up and reflecting the torch. Alex followed them all the way to a junction with the main railway. It had taken him 30 minutes and he was almost back where he had started, but, shining the torch round him, he saw why Ian Ryder had sent him the long way round. There had been a tunnel collapse. About 30 metres up the line, the main railway was blocked. He crossed the tracks, still following the maps, and stopped. He looked at the paper, then again at the way ahead. It was impossible, and yet there was no mistake. He had come to a small round tunnel, dipping steeply down. But after 10 metres, the tunnel simply stopped, with what looked like a sheet of metal barring the way. Alex picked up a stone and threw it. There was a splash. Now he understood. The tunnel was completely submerged in water as black as ink. The water had risen up to the ceiling of the tunnel, so that, even assuming he could swim in temperatures that must be close to zero, he would be unable to breathe. After all his hard work, after all the time he had spent underground, there was no way forward. Alex turned. He was about to leave, but even as he swung the torch around, the beam picked up something lying in a heap on the ground. He went over to it and leaned down. It was a diver's dry suit, and it looked brand new. Alex walked back to the water's edge and examined it with a torch. This time he saw something else. A rope had been tied to a rock. It slanted diagonally into the water and disappeared. Alex knew what it meant. Ian Ryder had swum through the submerged tunnel. He had worn a dry suit and he had managed to fix a rope to guide him through. Obviously, he had planned to come back. That was why he'd left the padlock open. It seemed that once again Alex had been helped by the dead man. The question was, did he have the nerve to go on? He picked up the dry suit. It was too big for him, although it would probably keep out the worst of the chill. But the cold wasn't the only problem. The tunnel might run for 10 metres. It might run for 100. How could he be sure that Ian Ryder hadn't used scuba equipment to swim through? If Alex went down there into the water and ran out of breath halfway, he would drown. Pinned underneath the rock in freezing blackness. He couldn't imagine a worse way to die. But he had come so far, and, according to the map, he was nearly there. Alex swore. This was not fun. At that moment, he wished he had never heard of Alan Blunt, Sail Enterprises, or the Stormbreaker. But he couldn't go back. If his uncle had done it, so could he. Gritting his teeth, he pulled on the dry suit. It was cold, clammy, and uncomfortable. He zipped it up. He hadn't taken off his ordinary clothes, and perhaps that helped. The suit was loose in places, but he was sure it would keep the water out. Moving quickly now, afraid that if he hesitated he would change his mind, Alex approached the water's edge. He reached out and took the rope in one hand. It would be faster swimming with both hands, but he didn't dare risk it. Getting lost in the underwater tunnel would be as bad as running out of air. The result would be exactly the same. He had to keep hold of the rope to allow it to guide him through. Alex took several deep breaths, hyperventilating and oxygenating his blood, knowing it would give him a few extra precious seconds. Then he plunged in. The cold was ferocious, a hammer blow that nearly forced all the air out of his lungs. The water pounded at his head, swirling round in his nose and his eyes. His fingers were instantly numb. His whole system felt the shock, but the dry suit was holding, sealing in at least some of his body warmth. Clinging to the rope, he kicked forward. He had committed himself. There could be no going back. Pull, kick, pull, kick. Alex had been underwater for less than a minute, but already his lungs were feeling the strain. The roof of the tunnel was scraping his shoulders, and he was afraid that it would tear through the dry suit and gouge his skin as well. But he didn't dare slow down. The freezing cold was sucking the strength out of him. Pull and kick, pull and kick. How long had he been under? 90 seconds? 100? His eyes were tight shut, but if he opened them, there would be no difference. He was in a black, swirling, freezing version of hell, and his breath was running out. He pulled himself forward along the rope, burning the skin off the palms of his hands. He must have been swimming for almost 2 minutes. It felt closer to 10. He had to open his mouth and breathe, even if it was water that would rush into his throat. A silent scream exploded inside him. Pull, kick, and then the rope tilted upwards, and he felt his shoulders come clear, and his mouth was wrenched open in a great gasp as he breathed air and knew that he had made it, perhaps with only seconds to spare. But made it to where? Alex couldn't see anything. He was floating in utter darkness, unable to see even where the water ended. He had left the torch at the other side, but he knew that even if he wanted to, he didn't have the strength to go back. He had followed the trail left by a dead man. It was only now that he realised it might lead only to the grave.